Welcome to the Classical Commons podcast, a conversation exploring the ideas, people, and trends in classical education. I'm Rob Jackson, founder of this digital platform, connecting classical school communities to talent and resources nationwide. Well, today's guest is an academic entrepreneur. He aims to revitalize education and teacher training with a good, strong dose of the tradition. But while Thomas Aquinas is certainly one of his touchstones and probably his patron, he also helps students to closely read those most influential works of modern education, exploring how progressives established their authority in relation to the tradition. Dr. Jon Kirwan is the director of the new Center for Educational Philosophy and Leadership at Christendom College. Welcome, Jon.
Rob, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we've known each other for a few years now. And as I've had opportunity to get to know you and understand kind of how your career unfolded, I didn't get to ask you about some of those sort of early years. So this is going to be the occasion, Jon. This is going to be it right here. You've experienced so many different types of institutional homes, and you've served in different capacities. An Indian mission at one point. You've been in diocesan work. Obviously, you went on to grad school at Oxford. I was impressed. I'll tell you, that was true when I first learned that. Right. But you also built university programs for teacher training. Just tell us, how did you get involved in the classical movement?
So I was at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and my previous institution, and there was a sense I went there to build and to start and build their graduate theology program, and there was an opportunity that the president and the VPAA, the vice president for academics, asked me to take over the Doctor of Education program, the EDD. Right. So I didn't know much about. I didn't know the who, the what, the where of this kind of modern back to the sources retrieval of these kind of perennial principles and sources and kind of loci of wisdom that animate this movement, right? But I was obviously my knowledge of the tradition came through exposure to philosophy and theology. So my kids have always I've got 6 kids. We've homeschooled with Memoria Press since day one. My oldest is off to college soon, and so I was kind of all in, but yet I knew nothing about this whole kind of explosion. And so but yet I know that the classical tradition obviously is very much a North Star for me in my own intellectual formation. And so there was this opportunity to take over the Doctor of Education program and refound it. And there was this idea of like, all right, we're gonna refound this Doctor of Education program along the lines of a Catholic anthropology. Right. And what does it mean to truly think through these things? So this really, this really kind of brought a number of kind of issues to the forefront. First of all, and I knew, all right, well, this is the EDD was founded at Harvard in 1921. It's very much the fruit of, kind of the halcyon years of the progressive ed movement when, all right, we're moving away from content specialty. We're moving away from, mastery of the subjects to more administrative. We're looking for technicians. We're looking for people to run bureaucracies. And so there's this idea of, all right, well, what would this even look like aligning, the EDD with, the Catholic intellectual tradition? And so, well, the first thing that's really interesting is, I mean, the EDD really has become a leadership degree, right? I mean, it really is. It's now with the proliferation of MA degrees. Everybody's got an MA degree anymore. So it's like the EDD is the go-to degree for so many different disciplines. We think of it as primarily a principal's degree or a superintendent's degree. Obviously now it's big in higher ed. College presidents, provosts, deans are getting them if they don't have a PhD. Right. And there is, but I mean, it's like career track cops are getting them, nonprofit people, corporate people are getting them. I mean, it's like you see everybody, kind of here comes everybody, to quote, James Joyce and the EDD. To try to, people, it's mid-career professionals. Yep. And it's a practitioner's degree, right? Yep. And so a lot of times people are the liberal education reform movements, they're skeptical. They're, well, isn't this credentialism? Isn't this what we, aren't we, kind of back to wisdom and things like that? And my response has always been, we need to work in the systems that we have. And if many of the progressive educators, they flipped kind of traditional education by getting our degrees right? And then turning them into something else. And so it's like, all right, well, we need to get these degrees so that we have a seat at the table and we can begin to engage in some of these questions of assessment and accreditation and, the nature and function of education schools and things like that. So it's just really this question of, all right, well, like what would, like a Thomistic, let's just say EDD look like?
Yeah.
And then how would this, and then, what does leadership? So it's become kind of an all-purpose leadership degree. And I know there's many people in, kind of aligned with us intellectually who would say, well, leadership, it's just kind of this, it's a $300 billion a year global fraud industry. Let's just abandon it and let's just go reclaim statesmanship and all this kind of stuff, which I love, But
Sure.
you know what? I kind of feel like, look, we have this thing, we've got this leadership thing, so let's figure out how to redeem it. So I did kind of a deep dive into like the history of leadership theory. It's intellectually fascinating if you're interested in modern genealogies. It starts in like 1930. Basically, every 10 years, it morphs into something else. And it's really driven by behavioral psychology, right? Like whatever is in vogue in behavioral psychology, that's going to be what. Or you could, like the Enron collapse that gave birth to the whole servant leadership thing. But every 10 years or so, it starts with the great man theory, and then Skinner and behaviorism in the 50s, and on and on. And so what I found was interesting in studying this, I'm like, all right, how are we going to fix this? I mean, how are we going to reclaim this? Is in 1998, with the birth of positive psychology, you remember Martin Seligman and this whole idea of like, all right, we're gonna stop studying pathology and we're gonna study how human beings flourish. And there's all kinds of hokey stuff associated with positive psychology, and but there's some really interesting things, and there's some really good work that's come out of it. Anyway, all this stuff starts to come into leadership theory in like 2003, and suddenly you've got all of these data-driven secular psychologists and leadership experts, finding that lo and behold, across cultures and across, demographics, it's like, what do you know? People flourish in the same way, no matter where they're from. And so suddenly you've got these secular data nerds, and theorists talking about eudaimonia and Aristotle and prudence. So I thought, well, this is great. This is where we're going to go back and if all of these modern studies show us that Aquinas was right when he's building on Plotinus and the classical tradition and Cicero in terms of explicating the 8 integral parts of prudence, well, great. Then we're going to use that as the gateway drug, and we're going to go back to show that Lencioni and Jim Collins and all of these guys are riffing basically on kind of the genius of Aquinas on leadership or prudentia. Right. Yeah. So it was this question of, all right, but we read, but of course the EDD is it's a research degree. It's very much engaged in social science. So we need to think, this philosophical realism, that we think of at the heart of Aquinas or Aristotle or, whatever, Scottish common sense in a more nominalistic way. Right. We think of this kind of realism as fundamental. And so things like qualitative methods, well, this is going to be a problem for us because this is usually the way that qualitative methods is done in social science. There's huge problems with it because it's very much associated with existentialism, right? There's no metaphysical foundation to this thing. So we actually, we teach even qualitative methods from this idea of critical realism, that there is a reality there that we need to shape ourselves towards, right? And this is what leadership, this new virtue leadership theory is. It's like when you recognize, and there's like big leadership institutes and universities are all recognizing this, that, we need to shape, true leadership only comes when you shape yourself to reality. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The business schools are way behind. I mean, business school, it's very much situational ethics. It's like leadership. As long as you don't get, there are 48 laws of power. As long as you don't get caught, or kill anybody, it's like the end really does justify the means. Yeah. So it was this idea of like, all right, we're going to rethink a doctor of education from the ground up. And we're not just going to take this progressive ed credential and figure out, all right, like, how can we square this? How can we make sure, like, to be quite frank, how can we make sure it's not woke? Right. Yeah. And so, and how can we, we're going to rethink this thing. So, there's a lot of work being done on humility and leadership. All right, great. Let's take some of this data driven stuff and let's go back and let's read Catherine of Siena. Right. I mean, on humility or Teresa of Avila. Right. There's this great conversation on humility in the tradition. and or self-knowledge. This is a big thing in virtue leadership now.
Right.
Say the data guys. All right, let's go back and read. Newman's got some fantastic things. What about Augustine on the order of the loves?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, this
That's
is
right.
all like deep. I mean, these are people grappling with self-knowledge on Joseph Pieper, even leisure.
Yep.
Right. It's like there's this philosophical self-knowledge. There's a theological self-knowledge in Augustine. There is, even a spiritual or a moral self-knowledge in Newman, as you know, where he's like, you're kind of like raking your conscience over the coals.
That's right. That's
right. Pieper in the modern sense does it better than anybody, even in terms of contemplation and things like that, the philosophical act. So it's like the tradition has said everything about leadership that we need, but we do need to package it. And that's where these modern theories come from.
Yeah.
So whether it was pushing back on progressive ed, recovering Aquinas on prudence, reading Lencioni side by side with Aquinas, I mean, on and on. We're like, all right, how can we completely re-envision this thing so that we can truly train leaders? We've got an organizational change class that's fantastic. I mean, most organizational change courses are really problematic because why? They've got these really faulty notions of change, right? It's, Hume on change, or it's Cartesian on change. And it's like, all right, let's go back, start with, various philosophies of change, realize why we need Aristotle, and let's apply that to organizations to understand, all right, what versions of organizational change are admissible and what are not in terms of a Christian morality or a classic morality.
Well, that's
what we're doing.
I was going to say that's really important because you have been working at Catholic institutions. Every one of the authorities you just cited, powerful voices from this tradition, most, if not all of them, Catholic. And as such, I'm just asking myself what seems to be an obvious question. How is it that what you were doing at St. Thomas, now at Christendom, was in a sense a novelty? Where had Catholic higher education been for roughly 70, 80 years in its adoption of the EDD or the Masters in Education? Where were they all this time when that tradition was accessible to them as well?
Rob, that's a really interesting question, and the answer is a little bit painful, right? But it's an answer that needs to be stated, right? This is what I found is that there is this struggle for Catholic identities that animates many sectors of Catholic religious or ecclesial life, and education schools have done a fantastic job. And I say this, tongue in cheek, they've done a fantastic job of guarding their credentials very well. Right. So you time and time again, I mean, you very rarely will meet any Christian who, even let's just talk like broadly speaking, evangelicalism or something, who has education degrees, who know the tradition really well. Right. You just don't find them. And, they when you come out of the ed schools, it's like there's a real indoctrination there in terms of pragmatism and Dewey, the project method, this kind of Uber assessment. And now we're at this like norm adaptive testing and math. I mean, it's like you end up, that's because that's all you hear, And so I meet time and time again, I meet really good Christians, really well-meaning Christians, but who've been like completely co-opted. Right. And they've lost, they think that somehow the anthropology of John Dewey or Kilpatrick or George Counts, right, or David Sneddon, right, all these kind of fathers of progressive ed, that somehow the anthropology is really not a big deal. And they don't even know that what's at the heart of these is a radical denial of truth from which everything flows. So if you want to do the child-centered thing, great, but you can't do it like they did. Right. Because that flows from, once you deny correspondence between the mind and reality and the ability to know God through the created order and to know, causes or the first cause from effects, et cetera, et cetera. Once you do that, you're going to end up at doing, Rousseau's Emile. Right. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And you can go the social efficiency route or this route or that route. But and what I found is in education, like people just don't know the tradition. They do not know.
And that's Catholic higher education as well. You're saying that's true of Catholic higher education.
Oh, yeah, largely. Absolutely. In education schools. Yeah. People will know the tradition outside of education schools, but they not within education schools are in some respects are the most insular places in higher education. And,
it's interesting you say this because I visited a conservative Christian college in the in the East, probably 15, maybe 18 years ago now. And it was well known for its staunch position. We're not going to cow to the Fed, and we are going to carve out our position here, and we're going to stand tall. And as such, we are not going to allow the state to interfere with our liberties, right? And our position on these matters. And yet, when I went to the Department of Education within that college, I saw a very clear demarcation. Like they had, as you said a moment ago, they had already sort of adopted what was necessary to be cozy with and get their credentialing system, hook up with the credentialing system of the state, and just make it a fast pass from their college, their very conservative Christian college, to the mainstream of K-12 education in that state. And I was actually very surprised at just how this Department of Education had been able to carve out its own almost autonomous function within ostensibly a very deeply conservative religious institution. And so that was on that one end of the spectrum. And then obviously Catholic institutions, there's a wide range of Catholic institutions, some of which as institutions have largely given themselves over to the zeitgeist. But I wonder, as you were describing and as you were experiencing, as you were building this school down in Houston, if you discovered any fellow travelers, right, within the larger Catholic ecosystem of higher education. Did you find any other outposts that seem to be moving in this direction, especially this direction of saying we're going to retake these institutional forms by adopting their licensure and their credentialing system and their degree track, but revitalizing it with the tradition? Is there anybody else kind of working in that direction, or again that you consider co-laborers?
I think so. ICLE would certainly be, I think, the closest thing. But very rarely. I mean, they're working. They've got their own strategy and mission. Wonderful people, and they're working to kind of do this as well. But in terms of, and they've even got they're working on their own credentialing. But in terms of doing what I was trying to do, I didn't find anybody. And I'll tell you, I mean, what you said about being surprised at, being confronted with this conservative Christian college with, a very kind of progressive, I could give you numerous examples in the Catholic Church, in Catholic higher ed, of that same principle, where it's like these universities or institutions have completely made a stand on all the hot button moral issues, and they're pushing back, but everybody knows, but their ed departments are very progressive. And does this mean that, their ed departments are out there, kind of flouting the catechism? No, but there's this mindset that it's like, well, John, ultimately we can really square progressive ed, the principles of progressive ed, with, kind of a Christian orthodoxy or something, and that's really the fundamental question. And I think there's a real philosophical, there's clearly some irreconcilable first principles, but I think, I mean, I've taught, when you teach the history of progressive ed, and I've taught, a number of, kind of left of center mid-career public school administrators. And it's like, everyone is surprised about how incongruent and, problematic the history of progressive ed is. But yet all of these shibboleths, people just take these things as truths. And they function in this world of, like, with these, no sage on a stage, no drill and kill, no child, no teacher centered. Sure.
Right. We're going to, on and on. We need data. We need, social emotional learning. I mean, these were all people that got on board with the whole language in the late 90s. And then quietly said, well, we'll do something else now, after the data was in that it was a disaster. And it was a disaster. Right. Yeah. It was a disaster. So it's like, that's what the ed school's on. It's like, what's the trend du jour? Yeah. What's so fascinating to me as we're talking is how Newman predicted this, did he not? In the 19th century, he said, inasmuch as theology should be rightly the queen of the disciplines, if there is not that overarching hierarchy of knowledge that the university was originally given as its mandate, philosophy and theology, right? You have to study all of the liberal arts. You have to be completely conversant. And then perhaps, right, as you achieve some station and some foothold, right, on really the heights of knowledge and understanding, they come together, and we see at the pinnacle how philosophy and specifically theology bring together a coherent vision of the order, right, the cosmic order.
Right.
But Newman predicted that was being diminished in the 19th century. From his own experience at Oxford, he could see how that had been displaced over centuries for a variety of reasons. And he said, but something else will have to step into that void, right, into that vacuum. And your comments around social science, or the social science methodology, the sort of ostensibly value neutral, an anthropology which is divorced from that philosophical realism that you described earlier, that really has influenced education, and not education alone. Perhaps much of the university world is now driven by this data that you're describing in order to sort of substantiate or provide some kind of legitimization or authority for why we do what we do. Again, as we follow the data. But the data, as you and I both know, requires interpretation, requires, as you said earlier, prudence, requires the ability to see and to sort of recognize not only the patterns present in the data, but the patterns that effectively echo reality, that they're again reflected in a longstanding tradition of observation and really philosophical speculation. I wonder if, as the social sciences have come into the ascendant, if what I hear you saying is that there's not a way to sort of bring it around with better social science, and that maybe that's dreamy of me, but I'm going to be a little Quixote. I'm going to take a crack at the windmill now, just as you're doing in education.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's not a way for us to see in some quarters of the social sciences, and specifically the ones you've mentioned, a return to Aristotle and virtue in the conversations around education, in trying to better understand leadership as it relates to human nature. And one of my personal favorites is anybody who's listened to me, where we're seeing cognitive science and the science of learning beginning to point really to these perennial practices, effective pedagogies of memory and attention, right?
Yeah.
And rhetoric, right? And on and on. I wonder if there's not a way for those aspects of the social sciences to provide us a corrective to what has effectively infected and perhaps sidelined much of the good intentions, right, of our fellow educators. Any thoughts on how these turns that you're describing in the social sciences might be a part of the recovery that you're undertaking?
Yeah, it's such a great and really interesting historical question, Rob. So here's one of the great tragedies, and this is kind of a larger answer, then I'll drill in a little bit, is for the first 70 years of the progressive ed movement, right? And so the progressive ed movement is very much tied to the advent of behavioral psychology, right? Edward Thorndike, as you know, right? And he's drawing on some German sources and things, but he's the guy to bring in this, like, there's no reality. Nature as nature, can only be considered real if it can be measured. We're going to measure everything, and anything that can't be measured, doesn't count as reality. It's almost like, Kant, and things in themselves, and, there was a really robust tradition of Catholic pushback. I mean, there was like the Catholics. There was some thinkers at Catholic University of America early on in its creation. There was Catholic social scientists, and they all recognized if social science needs Catholicism because of the robust anthropology that you were highlighting, and if we don't provide this service of basically philosophically fixing, so to say, social science, it's going to be a problem. This is like early 1900s, right?
Right.
And this tradition, I mean, Fulton Sheen, most people think of him as his popular work, but he was a good philosopher. He was at Louvain. He was a good Thomist. He was, he won a philosophy award for his dissertation. He had read widely. He was writing against behaviorism and psychology and these trends in the 30s, right?
Yeah.
Maritain is pushing against the 40s, Adler before his conversion. He's starting to adopt, this Aristotelian approach.
Sure.
Maynard Hutchins, I mean, there was this really robust, kind of and almost institutional and serious rebuttal or rejoinder to this, because now it's been, so much of the data has been disastrously wrong, right? So you think of, so you're talking, I mean, Thorndike was instrumental. One of his big contributions, if we can call it that, was kind of dismissing even, kind of what we call the faculties of the soul, right? As mere faculty psychology. William James kind of gives him some of the blueprints, but he provides the data, right? He provides this data that was all later refuted to get Latin out of the curriculum, right? That there's no mental discipline or mental training that can come about through studying Latin or through, skills don't transfer. If you study algebra, that's not going to transfer to something else, right? So by the 50s, all of that was debunked, and people realized, all right, like studying Latin actually is widely, there's great, really useful skill development there. Okay. Sure. But, I mean, you think about the first gen IQ testing that was applied to testing in the 20s, right? I mean, it's like on and on. It's like the data, the interpretation of the data, and not only that, even the collection of the data, the way the tests have been structured, have been wrong so many times. And yet it's almost, they almost have this character of divine revelation. Well, I mean, we hear this in modern ed schools. You're going to hear about this evidence-based. A teacher in our program was telling me that, he's always hearing from the principal, well, we're going to have evidence-based measures. Like evidence-based, like what? Like, I mean, whole language, social emotional learning, right? I mean, the student-led, peer-led instruction. I mean, we could go on and on. You and I could go 20 minutes about all the bad ideas that have been discarded over the last century that all had some kind of data behind them. So to kind of, you're absolutely right. There has to be a revitalization. We're trying to do our bit here, by kind of, thinking of qualitative methods in terms of, philosophical realism, right? But it's absolutely essential, because I have some students that say, well, let's just get away from the qualitative studies. It's too late for that. Like, and so you think of people like Mark Regnerus and people who are doing really good work. We have to be in there, because qualitative methods, when it's done well, it's really helpful.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I want to draw our attention, our audience's attention to the center that you're running here. And so I've got up on the screen for our viewers, Christendom College, and then you have the center here. And I want to make sure I get the full name right? This is the future of Catholic education is this center, right, for educational philosophy and theology, right?
Leadership.
And leadership. I'm sorry.
Leadership.
So philosophy. And I was going to say the theological is in there, and I wanted you to unpack that. But philosophy and leadership, and we've talked about that as how those both education and leadership have sort of fallen prey to really questionable philosophic grounds. And I'm interested in how these graduate level programs that you've built first at the University of St. Thomas, Houston, but now at Christendom, might actually give and make contribution. Because of course, I think our listeners and viewers know grad school is for professions, right? It's medicine, it's law, in your case, education and educational leadership. But classical education, with which you've become familiar over the past decade or so, is really something of a recovery effort, right? It has a long-standing tradition, 2,500 years or more, but it's really only been the last 30 years or so that this is, that classical liberal arts education has taken, has really come into its own. And I'm wondering what you're emphasizing in your program at Christendom that would help the next generation of teachers and leaders to really take hold of the things we've been talking about. In other words, find their way in a profession that has largely been misguided. Again, let's assume good intentions, but the wrong path, the wrong direction. And what will your graduate programs, how will it equip future teachers and leaders in schools to actually reorient their faculty, reorient their school, reorient their families for that matter, right? As they teach and lead their students. So the big question for me is, if there are things you have seen and are now picking up in the classical liberal arts renewal that you've integrated, that you intend to integrate at the center, so that school leaders Catholic school leaders can return to their schools or their diocese and really be a part of the renewal of that tradition in their region, in their locale? What are some of the primary features, right, that you're going to be emphasizing in the program?
So we essentially have taken the two, kind of most influential or most prominent, educational credentials, the EDD, as we mentioned, and the MED, right? The first thing is we've put them all online. I was not an advocate of online learning until COVID, and I really opposed it and refused to kind of get on board with it. But after COVID, I realized that, all right, for people have different ideas about online learning. For me, if it's synchronous and I'm on in the evening or on Saturday with a group of people on Teams, right? It's not the same, but boy, can you do it. And it allows you, for example, it allows me to build an education faculty, because if I was just going to build an education school and it was going to be in person, there wouldn't be enough PhDs in education that live within 1,000 miles of me to even, that understand the tradition to actually pull it off, So this really does allow people from even all over the world who are really wanting, a philosophy of education, but grounded in practical application in the classroom. So in the EDD, we do, it's very much, preparing people for leadership roles, and so I bring in corporate C-level execs to do strategic management and to do, a lot of the skills that they need. When I was first kind of getting started, I was talking to people in the Ed renewal movement and saying, what do you need? What can I do? How can I, design an EDD for you? And they said, look, we've got so many people who can read Augustine's City of God. We really have trouble finding people who can hire and fire and run building committees and fundraise and do 5 years and 3 year, 5 year, 10-year strategic plans, etc. Right. So I started to think really, and then all right, let's rethink. Let's take all of these kind of traditional courses in the EDD, but let's rethink them in terms of training people for all of the vicissitudes, all of the trials, the joys, the sorrows, of leadership, right? And so we really, but let's root leadership in this classical model, as we said. And what that does, I think, is it, if you're reading whatever Cicero on leadership, or whether it's Aquinas on prudence and the 8 integral parts, and you're applying these to, there's lots of good leadership material out there. But I think the problem is all these pop leadership books, they're not grounded in, this kind of, this robust classical anthropology. And once you can show how Lencioni on teamwork actually is really, it works because it's rooted in, what Aquinas has to say about prudence, where Aquinas talks about deliberation and memory and circumspection. And so it's like, all right, let's rethink leadership to really prepare them. For the MED, it's like, all right, how are we going to train teachers? Well, I think there is this recovery of the tradition, right? Whether, and so this is about reading, whether it's, Bonaventure's Retracing the Arts to Theology, whether it's Newman, as you said, whether it's, Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit constitutions, these great kind of monuments of educational tradition. And so it's about recovery, but it's always, engaging in what does this practically mean in the classroom, right? How do you, and I think one of the things that I think as I was kind of coming into this, because I cut my teeth in, some really tough trial by fire classroom experiences. I mean, I remember I did a lot of inner city teaching in different parts. And I remember starting one year with no teacher's aid and 39 elementary school students in South Central LA. It's like, I mean, you want to talk, it'll make or break you.
That's right.
So I think sometimes in the classical movement, or this the liberal arts reform movement, these can really be, the management aspects sometimes can, we get lost in truth, goodness, and beauty, and all the rhetoric and all that. And we forget that it's like you've got to walk up to the front of that room, put your hands on that podium, take control of the situation, and drive the bus.
I have to say, interrupt you real quickly to say, as I've gotten to know Doug Lamov a little bit, and his work with Teach Like a Champ, it dawned on me, as you said a moment ago about some of these other sources, he's just doing a very Aristotelian thing by observing good, effective classroom teachers, and then providing a taxonomy so that others, junior, novice teachers, can come along and say, look at it, and I want to do some of that, right? Because that seems to work. Now,
Yeah.
again, we have to be judicious and we have to find the right technique for a given moment. But that classroom management, that sort of very practical know-how is so crucial to the continued advancement of liberal education. We can't overlook it. So in that vein, you're an institution of higher ed, and as you put out EDDs, that's a research degree. I assume there's going to be a research component. Is that right?
It's a standard EDD. The
Yep.
way that you get students through the EDD, these are all working professionals mid-career.
Yep.
It's 3 years out the door to get the ed doctorate. And the way that you do it, the dissertation, unlike the PhD, so you did a standard PhD dissertation. That's yeah. And
Yep.
so that's what I did. And this in an EDD, the dissertation's baked into the program. Right.
Okay.
So it's like everybody's does the same chapter one. The chapter one chapter, there's 5 chapters. Each chapter is kind of an immovable topic or theme.
Okay.
And everybody does, it's a relay race, basically. Everybody starts chapter 1 at the same time. Everyone starts chapter 2. Everyone starts chapter 3. And this is how it's hard. It's a really hard 3 years. It really is. But it's like you're out the door and these people all have families and they're all, so that's the way you do it.
Well, I ask, is that research? It doesn't have to be original research, but is it going to be looking at the questions of that we've been discussing in terms of how these individuals go into leadership and actually look at their situation and their context and begin to carve out a way forward to adopt these principles and this anthropology? Is that part of that what that EDD will incorporate?
It can, but remember, with an EDD dissertation, it's always concerned with problems of practice.
Okay, right. And I guess where I'm going is, what are some of the primary? I know you don't have your first, you're just getting that first cohort together, but do you have a sense for what some of the topics are or the areas of interest where, again, in practice, these individuals will be looking at and researching these questions of practice? Where do you think the top 2 or 3 are going to be?
Oh yeah, I mean, we desperately need this, Rob. Yeah, because so these dissertations can go 1 or 2 routes: quantitative methods, or qualitative methods, right? And so, or you can do a mixed methods, which is more infrequent because it's time consuming,
Sure.
But qualitative, I mean, there's fantastic qualitative studies, on student engagement, kind of classical leadership, or teaching methods. What kind of teaching methods find the most success or resonance with students?
Sure.
She's a professor now. So this was a PhD. This was actually a PhD dissertation, but it was a qualitative study on how principals are developing magnanimity amongst their students. And it was so good. It was so good. She got into some of the questions of what is magnanimity and some of the terminological issues and the tradition and how Aristotle conceives of it. And she but it was then, these questions of, all right, and like these really serious principles, how are they thinking about magnanimity? And of course, like, magnanimity, I mean, this is a great, antidote to, to kind of sloth, this kind of pandemic vice of sloth that we see today,
Right.
So, I mean, there was like all kinds of leadership questions about, what kind of, leadership styles work the best. I mean, there's an awful lot of data, performance, various, kind of models of school and how they perform. We're in desperate need of our own social science research.
Yeah, I think that's right where I was headed. And as you know, I never miss an opportunity to plug Principia, which is a new peer-reviewed journal, 3 years old now. I guess it's not new, but we're really looking for that kind of research. So I hope that your grad students are going to not only be reading Principia, but potentially contributing to it in the years ahead, because I think this new wave, this sort of revitalization of education and using social science and obviously being philosophic is going to help classical education and liberal arts education continue to thrive. As we kind of come to the end of our time together, I wanted to ask you, what are the goals for the Center at Christendom in the next couple of years? Like, what do you really want to see? What's success, as the saying goes, for you in the next couple of 3 years?
Well, the first thing is, we want to credential and we want to form as many Catholic leaders and even non-Catholics. I've welcomed into my previous program many Protestants because we're the only game in town, and I know there's some that are inspired by this program and are hoping to start maybe their own EDD, but the EDD is a really tough nut. It's not like we're going to start a classics program or an MA in classical education. It's, as you're a PhD in education. There's an awful lot of moving parts, whether it's the IRB committees and on and on. So we're ecumenical, and so we want to train as many leaders as possible. And within that training, it's very important. We want to have conferences. We want to have publications. We want to. One of the things that we're really focusing on that I don't see a lot of people doing is we're really engaging the progressive education, the legacy, right? Yeah. And I think this was kind of interesting, Rob. I kind of stumbled on this by accident. I had a number of faithful Catholic normies, none of whom had a great liberal education, and they needed a class on theology of education or something. So I do modern theology, that's my specialty. And so I said, all right, well, I'll just, progressive ed, that comes natural to me since it's modern intellectual history and things, and I know it pretty well. Sure. And so I taught this. We read Dewey, we read all these, all the villains, and we read them side by side with Abolition of Man, right, which is very much, a rejoinder to that, and Dawson's Crisis of Western Education, and some Newman. And I'll tell you, I've never had students who were so animated, so engaged, frankly, so angry. They were like, why did we sacrifice the great tradition, capital G, capital T, for like the sterile world of pragmatism, So this is to answer your question is I really feel like Christians were doing a really good job up until the early 60s, both Protestant and Catholic. We think of like William Bagley, right? There was a great article in Principia on Bagley, back in one of the early issues, right? There was a whole, there was lots of Catholic thinkers that were pushing back, and it's just gone. It's just kind of, now we're just setting up parallel institutions, and what I want to do is recover, this. We need to be reading, the progressive. By the way, Dewey lost, as you know. Everyone thinks, oh, it's just footnotes to Dewey. The Deweyites lost. They lost to the industrialists. They lost to the data scientists, right? And the Deweyites were constantly, it's like the ghost of Dewey is everywhere. But we need to be reading Dewey, Counts, Kilpatrick, Snedden, like in theology, like we read, the Gnostics or Nestorius or Arius, right? I mean, we because it would be inconceivable. Athanasius would make no sense if we didn't read Arius, right? And so I found what we're one of the important intellectual contributions we're trying to make is revitalizing this. So, for example, I think the 40s was a really high point of resistance to progressive education in the Catholic world. It had really, we think of like John Senior or, where did it begin for Catholics, Yeah, right. I think really the best years were in the 40s. And this is when we had like Maritain and a number of others thinking really deeply about how to push back and really oppose all the errors with CNI, as they call it, curriculum and instruction, and the social science, the data stuff, the pragmatism, the denial of any kind of objective reality. I mean, there was really good work being done. There was an esprit de corps. We had networks of intellectuals who were pushing back on these things. So this is one of our contributions too, is we want to, in a very charitable and ironic way, we want to retrieve the tradition. We want to, think deeply about how to apply this to modern classroom management, instruction, discipline, etc. But also we want to push back because there's been too many bad ideas that have been unopposed. I mean, we could talk about these for hours. We mentioned the whole language debacle, which, on and on.
It's coming to an end.
We're really trying to do. Yeah.
It's coming to an end, but yet there's a residual, right? And so there's going to be plenty of work ahead of us to try to not only root out and address, again, the misconceptions, or as you put it, the heretical elements, but to do so. And I like the fact that you're describing this as an irenic and very a winsome approach that says, really, we may have lost our way, but we're back on the path. And the tradition gives us that sort of true north to our compass, and we're going to recover it, and we're going to do this together. I'm really looking forward to it, that's for sure. And I do want to say that because Classical Commons is here to serve the needs of leaders and teachers and parents in K-12, what should they know about the program that you're developing there at Christendom that may be of help to them, even in this coming year, right? What should they be looking for Is there any advice you want to share how to go deeper in the tradition that we've been discussing?
You're the stakeholders and the members, and
that's right.
in Classical Commons. Yeah. Well, we're looking, we're going to try to bake this into even like a 5-year BAMA, or sometimes it's called a 4+1. So we're looking at getting a steady stream of students out into, out into the marketplace of ideas of the schools, and to really contribute. So we're trying to think of institutional ways that we can really help the mission of Classical Commons. And, I've been a big fan of your work for some years now. And, I want to, kind of, credential and shape and teach as many young aspiring teachers or leaders as I can that can be plugged into what you're doing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is how I see, my own role of contributing to this.
There's no question, Jon. You have not only the passion and the insight and the philosophic training, but you have that practical, there's the dad in you, right? You understand this is for the kids. And we've got to do this in order to leave them an inheritance better than that which we were perhaps given unknowingly, unwittingly, right, by our own parents. But we're reclaiming this tradition, and I'm just delighted to have you be a part of the renewal. I'm so glad that we've gotten to know each other over the years, and I'm delighted that you're there in Front Royal, which happens to be one of the most beautiful places in the valley. There, I can't believe that you get that as your backyard. I'm a little jealous. But now I've got a reason to come and visit. So
you got to come and visit, Rob. I'm looking at the Blue Ridge Mountains. We're in the Shenandoah Valley. I'm looking at the Blue Ridge Mountains. Making me jealous. Yeah.
Jon, thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's really good to see you again, and really good to hear about what you're doing. We look forward to promoting it broadly, very broadly.
Rob, it's always a pleasure. Can't wait to see you. Hopefully in the summer, maybe before that. But keep up the good work.
All right. God bless you, Jon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.